And these people in Alexandria were not so sure they were prepared to accept this new regime in which Ptolemy was reduced to a puppet. And so what they did actually was they appointed Ptolemy's brother, a younger brother, who comes to be known as Ptolemy the Eighth. His nickname was Physcon. That's a picture of him there, the lower. Physcon means, literally in Greek, fat belly. He didn't seem to mind it. He was a corpulent individual. So you've got two Ptolemies now ruling in Egypt. Ptolemy the Sixth, the true ruler, but he's been captured now by Antiochus. Physcon, ruling in Alexandria. You may be wondering what happened to Ptolemy the Seventh. He is the son of Ptolemy the Sixth, but he's only an infant, so he doesn't have much play at this point. So these two guys are both making claims to be rulers of Egypt. All right. Now, verse 27, the two kings, their minds bent on evil. Now, the two kings here are Antiochus and Ptolemy the Sixth, shall sit at one table and exchange lies. But it shall not succeed, for there remains an end at the time appointed. So these two kings get together and act as if they are going to form common cause to get rid of Physcon. But of course, in the back of each of their minds are designs to get rid of each other at the same time. So it's a very typically political, hypocritical, lying conversation among typical politicians. You know how that goes. So anyway, this is what's happening. The two negotiated hypocritically to destroy Ptolemy the Eighth. Of course, to do this, Antiochus realized that he needed more firepower, and so he went home at this point, leaving his puppet, Ptolemy the Sixth, to rule what remained of Egypt, excepting Alexandria, and he's going to go and regroup. He's going to fire up a bigger military engine and then come back to take over or to execute his plans. And so it's in this context we have verse 28. He shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. He shall work his will and return to his own land. So Antiochus is stopping by Jerusalem on his way from Egypt back to Syria. He stops there. He has his ally Menelaus help him levy a special tax on all of Jerusalem. He wants to fundraise, and he's going to gather money from wherever he can. And so he grabs as much money as he can from Jerusalem at this point. Then he heads back to Syria to engage in further fundraising so he can come back with his military force. While he's away, Physcon is able to stage a complete coup and drive out Ptolemy the Sixth. Because at this point, Ptolemy the Sixth has been greatly weakened, and Physcon is, of course, the guy the Egyptians in Alexandria are rallying to. What happens is that Ptolemy the Sixth, the son of Ptolemy the Fifth, flees from Egypt and goes to Rome. Remember, there had already been a relationship with the Romans courted by his father Ptolemy the Fifth and Cleopatra. And so he's a known quantity. He shows up in Rome and says, hey, you got to help me. Egypt is spinning out of control. Reinstate me to my proper role there. And so that's what's happening behind the scenes as these things are going on. Verse 29, at the time appointed he shall return. Antiochus returns, comes to the south, but at this time it shall not be as before. Well, this challenge launched by Physcon against Ptolemy, the puppet of Antiochus, brings Antiochus back with this much larger military force, and the year is now 168. And he shows up, but as it says here, it won't be this time as it was before. This time, when he arrives in Egypt, he finds he's not simply dealing with Egyptian powers, he's got Rome there, because the Romans have responded favorably to the appeal given to them by Ptolemy the Sixth. Now, it's not a huge Roman army that shows up. It's a fairly small, but very disciplined Roman legion that's there, and it's led by a Roman senator who's not a military man. He's dressed in a loose-fitting Roman toga, you know how they would appear, and he's standing there, and his name is, we'll get to his name in a minute. For ships from Kittim shall come against him, that is Antiochus, and he shall lose heart and withdraw. He shall be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay heed to those who forsake the holy covenant. All right. The Roman guy that's there is G. Popilius Linnaeus. It's one of the most famous incidents in ancient history in which Popilius drew a line in the sand, from whence we get this expression. Now what happened was Antiochus is there. He's got this good-sized Syrian army behind him, very impressive. And he, of course, is in his full military garb, looking very powerful. And then you've got this Roman guy, probably a little kind of, plump. A Roman senator, not a military man, holding a little rod and a few Roman soldiers behind him. So it really seems like a pretty disproportionate power would favor Syria. But of course, Antiochus knows that behind this Roman senator is the power of Rome itself, and that gets his attention. Well, Popilius says to Antiochus, okay, we have a treaty agreement with Egypt based on arrangements made by Ptolemy the Eighth, and so you need to understand if you attack Egypt, that is going to provoke a treaty violation that requires Roman response, and so you're going to be fighting not just Egypt, you're going to be fighting Rome. So what's it going to be? Are you going to go home, or are you going to proceed with this military expedition and tangle with Rome? Antiochus, a very proud man, is wondering what to do. He says, I need a little time to think about this. Let me go consult with my counselors. I'll get back to you in a day or two. Popilius doesn't say a word, but he takes that little wand in his hand and starts drawing a circle in the sand, and he draws a complete circle all the way around Antiochus. Then he says, let me make myself clear. If you step out of this circle without giving me a response, that will be deemed a declaration of war by you on Rome. What are you going to do? Now, Sigmund Freud had an expression called displacement. Displacement is where something bad happens at work, but instead of retaliating at work, you go home and kick the cat. You ever heard of that? Maybe you've been there. And that's what happened with Antiochus. He was completely humiliated. He had his whole army behind him, and yet he didn't have the guts to stand up to Rome because he knew what Rome could do. And so, angry and humiliated, he skulked away, saying, okay, you're going to have your Egypt. And that was the end of that. But now here he is with all of these forces, all dressed up, nowhere to go. And so, of course, Jerusalem is the major city between him and home, and he took out his anger and humiliation on Jerusalem. As the verse says here, he shall turn back and pay heed to those who forsake the holy covenant. There were some in Jerusalem who were willing to, by this time, forsake their own religion and support loosely using the term, the reforms that were going to be put in place by Antiochus, and so that's what takes place. This becomes this moment of great abuse in Jerusalem. He does several things. For one thing, he tore down a bunch of houses in Jerusalem to build a defensive fortress to prevent the Romans from making any further incursions into his own territory. But he does a few other things that are really calculated to simply insult the Jewish psyche, and especially the Jewish religion. He changed the name of Yahweh, the God of Israel, to Zeus Olympus. That's who we now are going to worship. He ordered the Jews to begin sacrificing pigs to Zeus. And if you know anything about Jewish religion, you know how abhorrent that would be. He prohibited the celebration of Sabbath days, festivals, or the rite of circumcision. He committed what's sometimes called the abomination of desolation, mentioned by Jesus in the Olivet Discourse, in which he went to the temple and took a pig and slew it on the brazen altar right there in the holy precincts in front of the temple. He plundered the temple treasury, and he left troops. As he left town, he left a bunch of troops behind him to carry out what amounted to a reign of terror over the next 3 years or so there in Jerusalem. Forces sent by him shall occupy and profane the temple and fortresses. They shall abolish the regular burnt offering and set up the abomination that makes desolate. So this incident in particular was the one that was probably the most outrageous from the Jewish point of view, in which he commits this abomination of desolation, sacrificing a pig. That happened to take place on December 168 BC. Well, the temple was taken over, of course, by the Syrians and was shut down. So as we were saying a couple of weeks ago, the temple ran in an uninterrupted way from the time it was put back in operation under Darius until it was destroyed by the Romans, with one exception, 3 years. And these are the 3 years, 168 to 165, in which it had been desecrated and, of course, controlled now by the Syrians. And so for this 3-year period of time, the temple is basically not operating. He shall seduce with intrigue those who violate the covenant, but the people who are loyal to their God shall stand firm and take action. There were 2 groups in Jerusalem, as you know. One group was called the Jewish Helenists. These were the Proto Pharisees. That term doesn't seem to be used yet, but it was the group that eventually became the Sadducees that we hear about in the New Testament. They basically embraced the pagan worship at this point. They were willing to not put up a fuss and simply allow the terms of new life in Jerusalem to be implemented as indicated. The other group were called the Hasidim, the pious ones. These are the Proto Pharisees. And they are the ones who really, in this case, heroically opposed the Syrian presence, oftentimes at risk of life and limb. The wise among the people shall give understanding to many for some days, however, but they shall fall by sword and flame and suffer captivity and plunder. We hear the details of this from the book of Maccabees, and it's given in excruciating detail what happened. This was like an underground resistance, sort of like the Nazi occupation of France during the Second World War. You know, there was a whole underground movement among the French to resist the Nazis. This is very much the same kind of thing. The Syrians were there, and there was a pretty ferocious underground campaign to push them off, but it was not successful, at least at the beginning. Many of these people were competent scholars of the Jewish faith. They had sort of underground worship services and teaching and so on going on. In spite of all of that, tens of thousands were martyred, some of them under horrific circumstances. There are great, wonderful stories of heroic martyrdoms that took place during this time, clearly reflecting a deep, heartfelt faith among many of these Jewish people who wanted to hang on to their faith in the face of this kind of oppressive presence. And so it's wonderful reading and very much worth taking a look at it if you have opportunity. When they fall victim, they shall receive a little help and shall join them, many shall join them insincerely. I think the best guess is that when it refers to this little help, it's referring to the Maccabean Revolt. The reason it's called a little help is because even though the Maccabean Revolt started with a pretty deep commitment to authentic, legitimate Jewish tradition, it went sideways pretty soon thereafter. And so it became highly watered down, and by the time all the dust had settled, this Maccabean Revolt had really, more or less, become a kind of almost a connection between the Jewish people and this Hellenistic culture in the form of the Hasmonean dynasty that came sometime later. So I think the term "a little help" used in the biblical text here is probably appropriate. There were early successes by the Maccabees, and this led many to join them, but they weren't joining out of sincere devotion to the Jewish faith or culture, but rather simply because they were trying to be on the winning bandwagon, and so it was that kind of insincere participation. Some of the wise shall fall, so that they may be refined, purified, and cleansed until the time of the end. For there is still an interval until the time appointed. The time appointed is the time of Messiah. We're still around 160 years out from the birth of Messiah. This did have a huge purifying effect on God's people, which is why when Jesus finally did reach the scene, there was a deep, legitimate, heartfelt population of people looking for God's Messiah. And we